Hi everyone, Lucy here from www.reconnect.me. I am super excited today because I have a wonderful guest with me on the show. Her name is Lyn McLean from EMR Australia. And Lyn is an author, an educator, and a businesswoman with a passion for helping people to live more safely with electromagnetic radiation. And I first came across Lyn's work a few years ago now. I was listening to a podcast, actually, the 180 Nutrition podcast, and they were talking all about electromagnetic radiation, and it's really something that I've been aware about for a while, and I think it's a super important issue to talk about today, especially with so many advancements in modern technology. And Lyn has written several books on the topic, including her latest book that comes out on what's going to be next week. So that by the time this podcast is out, it'll probably also be out, and it's called Wireless Wise Families. So, Lyn, thank you so much for joining me on the show today.
Lucy, it's my pleasure, and thank you for inviting me to be with you.
Oh, absolutely, it's a pleasure. So, Lyn, would love for you to introduce yourself to everyone. So, what brought you to working in this area of electromagnetic radiation and education behind that?
Well, Lucy, my background's in teaching, so I have a passion for teaching and for educating people of all ages, and I like people to have information because with information you can make informed choices. So I guess in coming to this issue, that's what I bring to it. But I actually got involved in this by accident, and that was about 22 years ago now, where I stumbled across the work of a brilliant author called Dr. Robert Becker. And he was an orthopedic surgeon who back in the 60s was doing work on electromagnetic fields. And he discovered that the reason that a frog doesn't regenerate a limb, whereas a salamander, who's pretty closely related to a frog, does, is because of the electromagnetic fields in their bodies. So he found that if he put a very, 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 very small electromagnetic field on a frog's limb, he was able to regenerate it just the way a salamander does. So this whole idea that electromagnetic fields could affect the body and could promote healing was tremendously important, and he used that to help regrow difficult to knit fractures in orthopedic surgery. So his technique of using these fields has been very widely applied. But learning this has also told him that, I guess, the human body is very susceptible to these fields, and that these fields can influence all sorts of activities, biological activities in the body. So his research then went on to look at some of the harmful effects of artificial electromagnetic fields, and he was one of the early authors to write about it. So I guess that's how I got involved in this issue. And around the same time, I found that as I started to learn more, a lot of people were coming to me asking for information because a lot of people were being harmed by the sort of exposure to electromagnetic fields, for example, from power lines, and they were looking for answers. So my journey has been one of great interest in this issue, but also a great desire to help people and to give information to people so that they can help themselves.
Absolutely. I think it's so important. And I have heard of Dr. Robert Becker because there's another guy that I follow in this space, Dr. Jack Cruz. I'm sure maybe you're familiar with him, and he talks a lot about Dr. Becker's work with electromagnetic fields. And you mentioned there, Lyn, so artificial electromagnetic fields, and then you're also talking about electromagnetic fields from nature, because everything does have its own electromagnetic field, right, including us. So maybe for everyone listening, just to kind of break things down a little bit and simplify it. So, I mean, what happens... Actually, let's back up here for a second. There's a few terms that maybe we should go over. So there's EMR and then there's EMF. Are you able to give a bit of an overview of that and maybe the difference between the two? And
I think it's just a question of how you want to apply them. EMF stands for electromagnetic fields, and that's the general term. Sometimes I talk about EMR, which means electromagnetic radiation, and that's the sort of radiation that comes from things like mobile phones, phone towers, NBN towers, cordless phones, Wi-Fi networks, and so forth. So maybe we should just talk about fields and radiation. That might be confusing.
So, I mean, what are some sources of man-made electromagnetic fields that we would be exposed to in everyday life?
Okay, well, one kind of exposure comes from anything electrical. So the power lines that feed into our homes, the wiring that runs through our homes, every electrical appliance, they all emit electromagnetic fields. And look, some people will say, well, does that mean that we have to go and live in caves away from electricity? And the answer is no, not at all, because the fact that these fields are there doesn't necessarily mean that they're a problem. We can only tell if they're a problem if we measure and find that, well, for some particular reason we're getting high fields. For example, some people live near high voltage power lines, so they would be getting higher exposure than people who live, for example, further away from a high voltage power line. But in any house, you can get high fields from electrical sources from wiring. So, for example, just the way that lights are wired in a home will have a big effect on people's exposure. And just the other day, I was measuring a house where the fields were all really, really, really low, even though there was a high voltage power line not all that far away. So the fields were low in the house, and then when we turned the lights on, they suddenly shot right up all through the front of the place. And it was because of the way the wiring was put in place for certain lights. So you don't have to live near a high voltage power line to have high fields in your house. And that's where we think it's really important for people to measure so that they know just what's there. And then you can take steps to avoid it. For example, if you know that you've got a high field coming from your meter box and your bed's right next to your meter box, you can move your bed to the other wall and eat right out of that field. So sometimes very simple actions can reduce people's exposure quite a lot.
Absolutely. And you just mentioned there about measuring exposure. So I know that you've got some different meters that you can do that. Do you want to let everyone know a little bit about how that's possible?
Yeah, sure. So far I've just been talking about the fields from things electrical. So we have meters that will measure that. They will measure the magnetic fields and the electric fields that come from anything electrical in the house. And that's especially good to do. A lot of people are looking for new homes. They're going to open houses and they want to check to see whether this house has got high fields, because if it has, you want to know that before you spend a whole lot of money on buying it and then perhaps having to rectify problems. So that's one example of where the meters can be really helpful. But I think really every family needs to know what the fields are that are in their homes. So, Lucy, that's one kind of field. But apart from that, there's wireless radiation. And wireless radiation comes from all those things I mentioned before. Wireless technologies like mobile phones, cordless phones, phone towers, Wi-Fi. And that's a different kind of field in a sense. So it operates at higher frequencies. And yes, we have meters that will measure that as well. And I think that's really important because these days there are so many appliances that people buy and bring into their homes that actually emit this wireless radiation. And a lot of people don't know that radiation is even present. So we will get people, for example, hiring our meters and then saying, I found I had these really high fields through my printer, but I didn't even know it was emitting anything. Or people will say, I'm using a computer that's wired into the modem, but it's still putting out wireless radiation. So they didn't actually know that these fields were present. And I think, again, it's really important. If you don't know what's there, how can you protect yourself against it? So measuring is the first step to actually making informed choices about what's going on in your home.
Absolutely. Yeah, just because you can't see it doesn't mean it's not there. And especially I think with the Wi-Fi and the wireless devices, I like to think of when I talk to people about it sometimes, like the analogy of the aeroplane. So, whenever we fly, most of us will know that we get told to turn off our devices so not to interrupt the functioning of the airplane. And I kind of think of it in a similar way to the human body, because we are electromagnetic beings, and we have, all these different types of devices can very well interrupt what's happening in our bodies from a human health standpoint. And what types of issues have you come across that can be related to these different devices, like in terms of health?
Well, it's very interesting because we absolutely know, and there's no argument on this fact, that these fields go into the body, that fields are set up in the body. So let's say somebody is standing under a high voltage power line. There are fields, magnetic fields, that are running through their body. If somebody's exposed to wireless radiation, again, that we know that those fields affect the body. So there's no doubt about the fact that the body responds to these fields. The question is how the body is reacting, whether it's causing health problems or not. And that's where the science is very confused.
Yeah.
There are a lot of studies that are saying, oh, no, look, everything's fine, it's fine, we didn't find effects. But there are a lot of studies, in fact, there are thousands of studies now that are showing that there were harmful effects on the body. So these might be on cells or on people or on animals that were exposed to these fields. And some of these harmful effects are consistent with, I don't like to say health problems, but they're consistent with not being very healthy.
Yeah.
So it doesn't surprise me that a lot of people are reporting symptoms. So some of the common symptoms are things like headaches. Now, I will bet that there are some people who are listening to us talk today who say, oh yeah, when I hold my mobile phone against my head, I get a headache. Or maybe after I've been talking on my cordless phone for a while, I get a headache. Or pressure on the head. These are really quite common symptoms. But there are also symptoms like sleep problems, depression, irritability, even aches and pains. Some people will feel pain in certain parts of their body after exposure. Some people feel nauseous. What else haven't I mentioned? I mentioned irritability. Yeah, so there's a whole range of emotional effects, but also physical effects on the body. And I speak to people every single day who are sensitive, who do react to this radiation, and tell me all sorts of really interesting stories. So, for example, there's one lady I know who, when she lived in her previous house, she could tell when her neighbours turned on their Wi-Fi, when they turned it off, and how much data they downloaded. And she could tell because of how she felt. Yeah. And you might think, oh, well, perhaps she was wrong. But every time she would feel these effects, she would go and get her meter that she bought from us. She would turn it on, and it validated the fact that the exposure had just jumped right up in her house from the neighbour's Wi-Fi. And the neighbours used to be quite surprised when she would talk to them over the fence and say things like, oh, yeah, you were downloading a lot of data last night, weren't you? And they'd say, yeah, we were. So that's just one example. We have other people who, for example, can feel different kinds of discomfort or different kinds of headaches in their body, depending on whether they're exposed to, say, Bluetooth or whether they're exposed to Wi-Fi. So that's really specific, isn't it? They can tell exactly what they're being exposed to by the kinds of headaches they get. And we get people who will tell me they just feel terrible when they go into a heavily Wi-Fi'd environment. So, for example, shopping centres. How many of our listeners go into shopping centres and after about half an hour, start to really feel pretty terrible, come out again and gradually start to pick up? Well, our shopping centres these days are full of Wi-Fi. They're full of mobile phone radiation. They've got very often mobile phone towers sitting right on top of them. So there's quite a lot of exposure in places like that. So, yeah, there are people who react very badly to this and people who know they react very badly to this because every single time they're exposed to it, these reactions occur.
Absolutely, and I can actually relate to some of what you're saying there. I happen to be quite sensitive myself, not to the point, I know there are some quite extreme cases where people are very, very sensitive and feel completely ill and they get different, maybe different things that appear on their bodies and those types of things. But I can definitely feel things as well. Like if I'm in a car with friends or something and everyone's got their smartphones on, I can feel that in my head. I feel fatigued, and it's amazing to just, be out in places these days as opposed to maybe several years ago before everyone had a smartphone, like, for example, going to the movies or, as you mentioned, in a shopping mall or going to a concert or something like that. Anywhere that there is a public place now, I can totally feel it when there are so many people around because, of all these different devices. It just, I can't even explain it. And it's a worry, but I think that because a lot of people are not aware of this, maybe they put it down to something else. That it's, I've just got a headache, it's normal, it'll pass, but maybe don't realise that it could be, the device that they've got in their pocket or that they're holding to their head, or other things that I find quite concerning, things like baby monitors, right? So a lot of people are unaware that they put their little devices next to their newborns or their very young babies, and these types of devices emit those types of frequencies as well. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's quite right. And sometimes they emit quite a lot of radiation. There was one home I went into and measured fields from a baby monitor, and they were really high. And the parents just picked up the baby monitor, unplugged it, took it out to the garbage bin and put it in the garbage bin.
Wow.
As I said, that's it. We're not having that near our baby. And I think it's interesting because, again, we're putting these devices in our homes and we just don't know what they're doing. So if we could see the radiation that was coming out of them, if it was a little red mist, for example, then we'd probably, I guess we could be a bit more cautious about it. We'd at least know that it was there. But the fact that it's invisible means that it's very easy to put it out of mind, out of sight, out of mind. And I think we need to start bringing this back to our conscious mind and thinking about what we are exposing our families to, because this is the first time in history that families have been exposed to so much radiation over so many frequencies for such a long period of time. So there's no possible way that we can say this is safe because we haven't yet done studies on the exposed population.
Yeah, it's almost like an experiment.
Well, it is for sure, because the research is going on now, but the research always goes on the people that are exposed. So, in other words, it's going on after the technology is on the market. And that's what I find a bit concerning. So, mums now with young babies, these children are going to be part of that, I think, global experiment to see what is going to happen to these kids when they've been exposed for a few decades. And I don't like the idea of kids being part of this sort of experiment. And that's why I think we've got to inform parents about what their exposure is so that they can then decide whether they want their kids to be part of that experiment or whether they want to take the precaution of at least waiting a few years to find out what the risks are more clearly and then making decisions about exposing kids.
Yeah, definitely. And, I mean, what do you think about, I know there's several countries in Europe that have actually banned Wi-Fi within schools. So if I remember correctly, maybe it's France and a couple of others. And then, but we still don't seem to, I don't know if is that being looked at over here that you're aware of?
Not in Australia, no. Although I suspect that might change for a variety of reasons. But it is interesting that other countries are doing more to protect, well, especially young kids. And I think it's incredibly important that we do this because, as I said, we don't know the consequences of exposing kids to wireless radiation from when they're really young for decades. But secondly, kids are very vulnerable to this radiation, so they're generally recognised as being more sensitive We know their skulls, for example, absorb more radiation than the skulls of an adult. So we should be doing everything we can to protect them. But apart from that, we've got to ask ourselves, what are the educational benefits or consequences of getting kids to use digital technology in the classroom from when they're, let's say, in kindergarten or even preschool? Are there any educational benefits? And when you look around at the answers, they're not clear cut, because there's certainly evidence that kids are not learning as well as they did in the past. And there have been cases where when schools pulled out mobile phones, for example, the kids' performance improved. So I don't think we can make the assumption that schools are educating kids any better with this technology. In fact, the reverse may be the case.
Yeah, and I think we were just talking offline before about the use of technology with children and the exposure of, you go out somewhere to a public place and you quite often see everywhere young kids with mobile phones that their parents have maybe given them to play with, to distract them, to keep them occupied. And yeah, it's a worry to see that. And you brought up a good point that many of these children and the generation that's coming up now, all they've ever known is this technological landscape and the technological age. What are your thoughts around that in terms of in terms of electromagnetic exposure, but in terms of just even the social behaviour and things like that?
I think it's a fascinating social experiment that we're seeing being enacted in front of our eyes. And if you look at any group of children, you'll see kids pulling out their mobile phones, talking on their mobile phones, texting, putting their mobile phones in their breast pocket. We know kids spend vast amounts of time on mobile phones and other wireless devices. So this is actually changing their behaviour. It's changing their interpersonal relationships. It's changing their relationships with their families. Kids are spending less time with their families. They're spending less time on activities such as reading. So that's got that's got consequences for their education. But this generation, I've heard it called the I generation, the generation that's grown up entirely with digital technology, doesn't know any alternative. So unlike previous generations that have grown up knowing how to use landlines or how to connect with the internet using wires, these kids don't. So for them, life with a mobile phone or with Wi-Fi is normal, whereas for society in general, it's anything but normal. This is this is quite different to anything that's happened in history up to this point in time. So the problem with that is that kids then don't have another perspective from which they can make informed choices. They can't say, my mobile phone might be dangerous, so I don't think I'll use it so much because it could also be adversely affecting my interpersonal relationships. Yeah. So I'm concerned that kids growing up with the digital habit are going to become more entrenched in that habit, and be really interesting to see what the consequences of that are for them as they become young adults.
Yeah, and there also seems to be maybe an addiction component to all of this too, and it seems that technology may be influencing the way our brains are firing, because of the internet and access to so many different things online and having so many different devices. It's almost like, there's this seeking and there's this sort of attachment to all of these electronic devices now. Yeah, it definitely takes away from the social contact that, we used to have. Sometimes I sit back and I go, what did we used to do before, we had computers and before we had phones and before we had these devices that we could read books on? Like, it's amazing. I mean, and of course there's upsides that, we're able to have this conversation now over a podcast, and there's so many good sides to it. But I think that the most important thing is to have awareness of the other side as well, and to be able to use technology in the most mindful and sensible way possible. Because of course it's not really going anywhere either.
Yeah, I think you bring up some good points there, Lucy, and I think that technology does have benefits, and certainly I would be the last one to argue that. But as you say, we need to be looking at using it more safely. So, for example, if kids have got a choice between connecting on the internet without being exposed to wireless radiation or being exposed to wireless radiation, which would you as a parent prefer to do? And I know that I as a parent would prefer my kids to connect without exposure to wireless radiation until it's been demonstrated that it's safe, and that's not yet the case. So there are a lot of ways that we can use technology more safely, and the problem is that people need to actually nowadays be taught that. So that's the purpose of my book, Wireless Wise Families, to try and say, well, here's the technology, but if you do this, you're going to be safer than if you do that.
Yeah. Do you want to talk a little bit about your book, Lyn?
I'd love to.
Yeah, go for it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, I'm very excited because it's just being released now. It's published on the 18th, so it's available in bookstores and from our website from then. But it's a really easy to read book. It's got lots of useful information. So it tells people what they need to know, I think, in a way that's easy to understand and to digest. So it's got little cartoons, it's got little charts, it has note pages where you can try some of the activities that we suggest. So it's not a heavy or a difficult read by any means. I'm excited too because I think it encapsulates some of the things that we have found that people need to know and don't know. So over the years, because I talk to people so much about this issue, I see what people know and what they don't know, and I've been able to use that to try and get the most useful pieces of information across to people in this book. So it covers really just about everything. It talks about how wireless radiation actually works so that people can understand how to reduce their exposure a bit more easily. It talks about why precautions might be a good thing. And then it talks about the different technologies, mobile phones, cordless phones, Wi-Fi. And it also talks about mums and dads who are exposed to this. So the thing that I find fascinating is, and I don't know whether you know this, but pregnant mums who are exposed to this radiation, that exposure can affect the unborn child. And similarly, a man exposed to this radiation can have the quality of his sperm affected. So I think that's got big implications for fertility and, presumably the health of offspring. And the book also talks about wireless kids and learning, relationships, when you're travelling, when you're at home, all sorts of things that you can do to use this technology more safely. So that's it in a nutshell.
Yeah, it sounds like it's applicable to all of us, right? And I have been aware of the exposure of pregnant women and also men, because I do happen to notice that most men, because they don't carry bags, have their mobile phone in their pocket. And I'd probably be willing to say a lot of them don't turn off the Wi-Fi or the Bluetooth or anything like that. And I have had conversations before with friends, my brother as well, just about that, like that you don't really want to be carrying that in your body because of the radiation that's emitted from that. And I suppose for pregnant women who are in sort of a more fragile state of health, it's got to be really, really careful about that as well. I think something that I heard I think it's Deborah Davis, the lady that, I can't remember the books that she wrote about the mobile phones, but I remember seeing her speak maybe a couple of years ago here in Sydney, and she said that distance is always going to be your friend when it comes to technology, when it comes to the use of these devices.
Yeah, I think distance is your friend, but also wires are your friend.
Wires,
If you can connect with wires, then you're just not exposed to any of that. So as I'm talking to you at the moment, I'm using technology. I'm sitting in front of a computer, but there is no wireless radiation here whatsoever. There's no wireless radiation in my office. There's no wireless radiation in my home. And that doesn't mean that we're not connected to the world. I'm not on phones or computers. I am all day, every day, but I'm doing it without wireless radiation, and I understand the quality is better too for doing that. So, yeah, love your wires. Yeah. That's a good tip for people.
Absolutely. You know what I think, because I completely agree with you, you know what I can kind of see as a little bit of a tricky point here is that we live in such a convenience culture that a lot of people, it's just so convenient for everyone to not have wires and to, you know, be able to log in right on their phone and, but this is why books like yours and podcasts like this is really important, to at least give the people the information to go, you know what, there's actually other options other than having every single thing that you own be a wireless device. You know, having everything at, you know, arm's distance to you or whatever the case may be, that there are other options and sort of more sensible and safer ways to use our devices without having to get rid of everything, as I know that there'd probably be people kicking and screaming if that were the case.
Yeah, well, that's right. And I'm sure that there will be times when people do need to connect from a Wi-Fi cafe or whatever it might be. And, yeah, of course, I understand that, but I think what we need to do is look at what our exposure is in the places we spend time. Yeah. For example, a home. Now, what about kids who go to bed with their mobile phones, maybe put their mobile phone under their pillow turned on so that they can wake up during the night to talk to their friends. Those sorts of exposures are the sort of exposures that worry me, because that radiation is very close to a person's body while they're sleeping, which is an important time to keep the body safe, and it's unnecessary. So there are lots of times we could actually reduce our exposure really easily, and we just don't do it because we don't think about it or because we don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm always looking for opportunities to where I can either minimise or not have to be exposed. Like I never have my Wi-Fi on my mobile phone, and maybe it costs me a little bit extra in mobile data, but I just choose to do that. And, you know, we always turn the Wi-Fi modem off at night or when I'm on, it's not in use at home. Yeah, there's so many little things that people can do. Do you want to maybe talk? Yeah, let's do a little bit of a practical thing. So what are some other ways that people can minimise exposure in everyday life?
Yeah, well, as I say, first thing, I know I'm repeating myself, but first thing is to measure, because if you don't know it's there, you can't reduce your exposure to it. So I just think that's a really important thing. And also good with kids too, because if you've got a meter, you can show your kid, this is what's coming out of this device. This is how far that signal remains strong. So we need to keep this distance away, turn it off, whatever you want to do. The kids can then understand why some of these precautions are being put in place. So number one, measure. Number two, reduce the amount of time that you're exposed to things that you don't want to be exposed to. So, as I said before, when you're asleep, when you're maybe sitting and watching television, when you're at work, try and reduce your exposure there, because that's where you're spending big chunks of time. Particularly important where you sleep, because that's where your body is healing, repairing, consolidating memory and learning. So exposure there has, in my opinion, got more consequences than exposure at other times of day. Things like mobile phones we talked about before, yes, people carry them on their body, but we, for example, have got mobile phone shields, so you can put your phone into a little shielded case, and that's going to block the signal from going into your body. So your mobile phone, if it's turned on, can still be talking to the phone tower, but that radiation is not going to be penetrating your body. For really sensitive people, we've even got shielding underclothes, shielding T-shirts and men's underpants. So again, that means that people can have mobile phone radiation not penetrating their body, or if they go to places like shopping centres where there's a lot of this radiation, they're being protected. Maybe your neighbour's got Wi-Fi, or actually somebody took to me by email this morning about a mobile phone tower that's right outside their office window and it's really close to them. Well, we've got shielding window film and shielding curtains that can go on windows to stop that radiation coming in. We've got shielding paint that can block the radiation from smart meters, for example, from coming into your home. So there are lots of things that can be done. One of the things I really caution people about, though, is be really careful of all those magical devices that are claimed to protect you from radiation without actually making any reduction in the amount of radiation that's there. So there are some things that you're supposed to stick onto this or plug into that, and they're claimed to maybe harmonise or minimise the harmful effects that people get. But the trouble is there's no way of testing whether they work, because if you hold a meter up against those devices, they make no difference whatsoever to people's exposure. So my advice to people is, if you're going to do something to protect yourself, do something that's going to give you a measurable reduction in exposure, so you know that it works. You can have confidence in the outcome.
How does the paint and also the clothing that you mentioned, how does that actually work in protecting us?
Well, yeah, this wireless radiation is effectively shielded by metal. So believe it or not, the shielding underclothes have got metal in them. They've got silver. So it doesn't actually look like they're silver, but it's the silver thread that reflects that signal. Same with the curtains. It's got a very fine copper and silver threads. Again, it just looks like ordinary, maybe a fine cotton, but with a little tiny bit of a sheen in the sunlight, and that reflects the signal. So those sorts of shielding products do provide effective blocking.
Wow, okay, that's amazing. And so you've got a couple of those different meters that you can use to measure the exposure. You mentioned before the ones that measure the electric and the magnetic, as well as the ones that measure the Wi-Fi frequency.
That's right.
So,
yep, that's right.
So those are available for hire as well as for purchase, is that right?
Yep, that's right. And in saying that, I need to let people know that it's supply and demand too. So sometimes people say, "Oh, I've got to have it today," and well, we can only do that if we've got them in stock at that particular time. So yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Beautiful. It's definitely very important to know what we're dealing with, because we can't see what we're dealing with. Yeah, these meters definitely do help. I remember I used one of yours several years ago, and it was amazing to see that where the placement of my bed was in my bedroom, there must have been on the other side of the neighbour's wall, because there wasn't anything in my particular environment that had any kind of I don't keep electronics in my bedroom anyway when I'm sleeping, but there wasn't anything that there could have been, and I thought, well, there must have been something on the other side of the wall, because as soon as I used the meter in that space, it went up really, really high. Is there exposure when it comes to things within the home structurally that the home is built of? So, for example, whether it's piping or things in the wall, electrical wiring, is it things to look at there as well?
Yeah, that is true. Sometimes water pipes are conductive, so they will bring a magnetic field into the house from outside the house, which tends to increase the magnetic fields right throughout the house. So that's one source. As I mentioned before, wiring can be an issue, particularly depends on how electricians wire things. And unfortunately, electricians aren't trained in this sort, so they don't really know about how to wire to reduce exposure. And as a little aside, my other book, The Fourth, does have information about how to build and wire a home so as to reduce exposure. So I think that's really important if people are building a new home or building an extension, to make sure that it's wired in ways to reduce exposure. Appliances will all have a magnetic field, but you can just move your appliance from here to there and find that the magnetic field in your bed has reduced dramatically. Smart meters are a bit of a problem in some places like Victoria, where smart meters have been rolled out, whether people want them or not. there are lots of complaints about very uncomfortable symptoms that people have developed when the smart meters went in, even if they didn't know that their smart meter had been installed, and even if they didn't know that there was a possibility of developing harmful effects from smart meters. So that radiation from a smart meter is just sending signals from your electricity meter to the network, the smart network, and that radiation is penetrating people's walls and going into their homes. And if the meter box is on a bedroom wall, as is very often the case, then it can be going straight into their heads as they sleep. Yeah. So that's a source of high exposure in some cases. So lots more that could be said about smart meters, but that's probably a good thing to look at, blocking. Yeah, so there are many sources in the home, and of course the wireless devices that we've talked about. So again, if you measure, you know what's there, and you can do a bit of an inventory. It'd be like checking your pantry to see what you've got in your pantry, in your kitchen that's good or healthy for your kids to eat, and what's not.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you know, what's the situation with smart meters in New South Wales? Because I know that you mentioned Victoria, and I know they were the first in Australia to have the rollout of the smart meters, and then New South Wales is next. But is that going to be something that would be compulsory here? Because that's something that I know that over in the States they've been dealing with it for a while now, and there's a lot of people that refuse to put them in. But if I remember correctly, if have them in their homes, that they receive some sort of fine. And I don't know if that's the case over here, but it seems that we should be able to have choice.
Well, it does, doesn't it? The trouble is that people have to, again, know what's going on in order to be able to make informed choices.
Yeah.
In Victoria it was compulsory, and as I understand, that whole exercise was such a disaster in many different ways that other states haven't really been keen to go down exactly the same track. There are a lot of digital meters out there everywhere in Australia, and all new homes, as I understand it, are being built with digital meters that have got the capacity to become smart meters. So that doesn't mean that they are necessarily smart meters now, but they could be. Now, a lot of electricity companies are encouraging people to make the digital meter a smart meter, and they're not even using the word smart meter anymore because there are so many negative connotations attached to it. They're calling it things like remote meters or remote metering or something like that, which makes it sound like it's okay, but it really just means that it's a smart meter. So I think consumers need to be really careful about what information they're getting from the electricity companies and what that information really means, and need to be really cautious about getting meters put in on their homes that are sending wireless radiation into their own homes as well as throughout the neighbourhood.
Yeah. Is it just a matter of speaking to the electricity companies and asking these questions? Because I know that I moved into a place recently, March, I think, this year, and I was aware that something was about to... I knew what happened kind of in Victoria, and I knew that New South Wales was going to be maybe having to deal with these. And I asked a few questions of the company, but as you mentioned, I think we're calling it under another name, and I wasn't really able to get any clear information as to, one, whether or not I actually have one in the building, and if we were to go with a particular supplier, if we would have to use their smart meters. It was still very confusing and not very clear. So it is, as you say, like, we don't know much about what's going on with them.
No, it's very difficult, and we get reports like that too. A lot of people tell us they ring up the electricity companies and say, have I got a smart meter? And the customer service people don't know, and they'll give them the wrong information. But basically, if somebody comes out to your home to physically measure or write down how much electricity you've used, that's okay. Then you can't have a smart meter because you're still getting manual readings.
Okay.
But if that's not happening, then presumably you've got a smart meter. And there are only some areas that have smart networks. So what I think people can do is just ring the electricity company and ask, is my electricity meter being manually read? That's pretty easy for most people to be able to answer. And they could also ask, is there a wireless network for in my area for transmitting this information wirelessly? And not necessarily use the word smart network because the electricity company mightn't be using that word. So it is really hard, and it's terrible that consumers are in this situation and having to go to extraordinary lengths to protect themselves from having potentially harmful radiation forced upon them.
Definitely. And something that's kind of come up for me as we've been talking about all this today is I look at health and life through this lens and philosophy of nature. And for me, what I've really learned of being down this rabbit hole for many, many years of health is that nature has equipped us with everything that we need to be healthy. And so, there are electromagnetic fields in nature that are fine. We need exposure from the sun, of course, smart exposure and safe exposure and natural light, and to be walking on the Earth's surface and obtaining negative electrons from the Earth's magnetic field. So I kind of look through the lens of, well, anything that's perhaps not coming from nature, it's very reasonable to question what is it actually doing to us, because we don't know. And it didn't come from the Earth. It wasn't something that's new. And because I do hear a lot of, there's no science around this, or this is, things get dismissed, or there's resistance. But I feel like there's a place for the science, and then there's also a place for looking at nature and who are we as humans in general when it comes to health, and what actually makes us be able to express this health that, is essentially our default state.
Yeah, I think you raised a really important point there, because I think that there are electromagnetic fields in nature. There's no question of that. Yeah. But humans have evolved to function in harmony with them. Yeah. And in fact, we feel good when we're in nature, generally speaking, and it's because our fields harmonise with the fields of nature. But what's happened is that in the last less than 100 years, mankind has dramatically altered the electromagnetic environment of the entire planet and introduced a whole range of frequencies that have never been there before, some of which we know are harmful. For example, some mobile phone radiation operates at the same frequency as a microwave oven, which we know cooks food, and yet we hold these phones up against our heads. So it's the artificial electromagnetic fields, the fact that they're new to this natural environment that we evolved to cope with, that I think is the problem. Yeah. And we cannot possibly introduce anything into society at one moment in time and then say, well, yeah, that's going to be safe for the next 7 generations, the next 150 years, whatever it might be, because we've got no idea. We have no idea what we are doing to ourselves, our children, our unborn children, our planet. There's research to show that this radiation is affecting plants, that it's affecting trees, that it's affecting insects, that it's affecting animals. So that's really interesting too. And you don't hear much said about that. But if this radiation is having a harmful effect on the natural environment and on the human body, then what the heck are we doing to each other? And isn't it time that we started to ask some of these questions before accelerating the rollout of these technologies?
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. I think that, we've gotten so far away from nature and our natural design and as you said, the harmony that we were designed to live in it. And essentially humans are part of nature, but I think that's been forgotten along the way as well. And the further that we go away from our natural design, the more separation that there is, the more that we will see these issues come up when it comes to our health. And electromagnetic radiation from these man-made sources is just one of those ways. But, the good news is at least, there's more education coming out about it now, and I feel like in a general sense in terms of health and what's going on in the world, that there is a global awakening happening across many different areas. It's just something that I suppose takes a bit of time, and it is not without resistance. But what do you foresee happening? Of course, we can't predict the future, but what do you maybe have a feeling that may happen, with all of this, with EMR, with the VEF, with the education around it, with technology over the next few years?
Personally, I'm a great lover of history.
Yeah.
And if you look at history shows you time and time again that unsustainable systems can't be sustained. Mm-hmm. And we don't have to look very far back in history to see that that's been true for asbestos, for lead, for very many things. And I think that if this radiation is not harmful, then it will be continued to be rolled out and people will be healthy and there won't be any problems. If this technology is harmful, then we can expect the number of problems to accelerate, the number of people reporting symptoms, and there are an awful lot of them already, to increase. We can expect the research to be finding more harmful effects, and we can expect that these technologies are not going to last in their current form and that people will be looking to safer technologies. So I think it will be really, really interesting in another 50 years to be looking back and seeing, what does the future hold, and what will people in the future be saying about us at this moment in time? Will they be saying, "Oh, that was a great innovation," or will they be saying, "Stupid fools"? You think they would have had more common sense. So I guess what I'm saying to people in this book, and in fact in all that I do, all the information on our website, is not that we've got any proof, not that I'm saying this is definitely going to harm you. What I am saying is, well, we really don't know all the answers at the moment. There is evidence of harmful effects. So if we want to take precautions, this is how you can do it. And I feel that that's what we do in society all the time with things that could potentially be harmful. For example, we make our kids wear seatbelts. We make our kids put hats on in the middle of the day when they go out into the sun. We put fences around pools, and we do that not with any guarantee that our kids are going to fall into a pool and drown, but we do it because it's a sensible precaution for something that could potentially be a problem. And it just makes sense to me that we would do that with wireless radiation at this moment in time, because we have no guarantees that it's safe, and we do have evidence that it may not be.
Yeah, do we want to take the risk to find that out?
Yeah, exactly. I'm a great lover of children. Being a mum has been the most important role for me in my life, and I love kids, and I really care about our kids now and our kids in the future, and I want to see our kids having the best possible chance and the best outcomes and the best opportunities. And I think, well, let's tell the parents what they can do. Let's tell the parents what's going on. Let's give the parents opportunities to put these precautions in place, and then they can make up their own minds. And I feel like I will be at ease when they do that, because at least they're making informed choices.
Absolutely. So, Lyn, we're coming up towards the end of the show, but is there anything that perhaps we didn't necessarily cover, or is there anything that you would like to further discuss or leave our listeners with in terms of what we talked about today?
I guess I'd just like people to think about their exposure, and this comes back to what we were saying before, that there are probably lots and lots of people out there who are getting headaches or having sleep problems or feeling a bit depressed or a bit nauseous, a few aches and pains, fatigue, as you mentioned before, memory or concentration problems, and they might be thinking, I'm getting old, or it's just I'm working too hard. So I just want them to think about, well, maybe it could be connected with exposure, and if they reduce their exposure just a little bit, if they turned their mobile phone off before they went to bed, if they turned the Wi-Fi off before they went to bed, if they stopped holding their mobile phone against their head, if they used air tube headsets, if they did anything to reduce their exposure, do they feel better as a result? And that is going to be the test for them about whether this radiation is impacting them at all and whether there's something that they can do to help themselves.
Beautiful. And I think it's also super important to be open to the fact that this is something that could be affecting each of us, because it is also very easy, I think, given that our culture is so consumed by technology and really it's just been built into our culture now, it's very easy to dismiss and say, oh, but that's crazy. It couldn't be my mobile phone, or it couldn't be the wireless device. But I think it's so important to just be open to the fact that maybe it could be. Maybe there is something to this. And to, as you said, we just try and do all these little things as much as possible and see if it has any benefit or effect. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, just if people think about what they're doing, think about their exposure, and not just act from habit, then I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, definitely. So, Lyn, did you want to mention, I know you've got a couple of other books as well, so did you want to maybe mention those, and we can put everything in the show notes for everyone for where they can read up more about those and where they could purchase things if they'd like to?
Oh, thanks very much, Lucy. Yep. Well, my book, The Force, I mentioned before, and that's a much bigger book. It's about 400 pages, and it covers each of the technologies like mobile phones, computers, power lines, and so forth, mobile phone towers, and it tells people what they can do to reduce their exposure from really just about everything, and including how to build and design a home to reduce exposure. So there's a lot of research in that book too, so people can go to the references of everything I write, really, and validate what I'm saying for themselves. They don't have to believe me. So that's The Force. There's another one that's called Wireless Wise Kids, and that's a little picture book, really, for young people, that's got very simple, easy-to-read text about what this I suppose really how to reduce exposure, how kids can reduce their exposure. And we say kids being kids from age 8 to 80 because a lot of adults have read through it and said, oh, I didn't know that, which is why I came to write Wireless Wise Families. So those are the three that are currently available. And, of course, we've got lots of information on our website, emraustralia.com.au.
And on social media as well? You're on Facebook and...
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And it's is it EMR Australia?
That's right, EMR Australia.
Yeah. I'd encourage everyone listening as well. I'm actually joined your newsletter, and you send out some really great information. And so I would encourage people to join up to the newsletter as well on your website, because, yeah, there's some great stuff happening there, and you're always keeping up to date with what's going on in this space, and it's really interesting.
Thanks for that, and that's free too. People can download that for free, and we put that out once a quarter. The new one is coming out this afternoon.
Oh, beautiful. Love it. Well, Lyn, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you coming on the show. It's been beautiful talking with you and for you to just share your wisdom and information in this space. It's so important. So thank you for what you do.
Oh, Lucy, thank you so much. I can't thank you enough for the opportunity to talk about something that's very close to my heart. And I really hope that your listeners have got something useful from today's conversation. So thanks and all the best.
Oh, thank you so much.